responsible for all the resources and the activities of the Hawk and Gripen systems. Also, I have a section called Electronic Warfare, which also falls under Director Combat Systems. This is not only for fighters, it is for the whole Air Force, for which I am also responsible. Chair.
So the whole Hawk and Gripen systems falls under your command?
Yes, under my directorship. Command in the military would be under the squadron officer commandings and the base officer commanding. They report directly to the General Officer Commanding Air Command. So in my role, I am responsible for all the planning, budgeting, and resource management of the two systems in support of the command line to carry out operations. Chair.
Thank you. Now, in paragraph 5, on page 1 of your statement, you indicate that following the retirement of the project officer for Project Ukhozi, you were appointed as the Chief Project Officer, Fighters at the Directorate Air Force Acquisition. When was that?
That was in February 1998, Chair.
And are you able to indicate to the Commission when was Project Ukhozi commenced with?
Project Ukhozi was commenced in 1994 initially, and then ran through until still is today a running project, Chair.
And you have already indicated that it was established to acquire an advanced light fighter aircraft for the South African Air Force, the Alpha.
Chair, initially it was established to replace the aging fighter aircraft fleets, and so it ended up after going through the process of the force design and reviews to make a final decision, and the final deliverable would then be an advanced light fighter aircraft under Project Ukhozi. Chair.
In paragraph 6, you indicate that then you served on the newly formed Air Combat Acquisition Team. Can you explain to us what that team was all about?
It was a team formed once the decision was taken that the Air Force required an advanced light fighter aircraft and a lead-in fighter trainer aircraft, due to the fact that these two aircraft formed a system of replacing the other aircraft or the currently operated aircraft. It was decided by the Air Force Command Council that a single team would be formed to pool the resources for both of these projects during that period of the project up until contract signature. Chair.
Were you also initially appointed to lead the project Winchester, or you only came to be involved later?
I was appointed as Project Officer Winchester during the formulation of the staff documentation, and then when both of these were included in the packages and the ACAT was formed, then I joined the ACAT and I headed up the DOD part of the ACAT team, which was, as I said, specifically formed for a phase of the two projects, Chair.
You were part of the ACAT up until the signing of the contracts in December 1999. Am I correct?
That is correct, Chair.
You say in your statement that once the contracts were signed, two separate project teams were formed for the further project phases, and you were appointed as the project officer for Project Winchester until October 2008. What does this entail?
Once contracts are signed for a project, then you enter into what is then termed the production and development phase of the program, the early part with the contractor, and that was the period in the UK, followed by the implementation or commissioning phase, and then that was during when I was implementation officer back here until October 2008. Chair.
You've already indicated that you were transferred back to the Directorate Combat Systems, and in August 2009, you became Director Combat Systems, and you are presently responsible for the Gripen and Hawk systems.
That is correct, Chair.
Now, we then have to deal with the background on page 2 of your statement. And you speak there in paragraph 7 that when you joined the South African Air Force in the 70s, the 3-tier training system was well established. And in that paragraph, you deal to a lesser detail with the 3-tier training system. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, as I alluded to when I did my wings in those days, it was done on the piston-engined Harvard aircraft, which was the first phase of your wings on that aircraft. And then about halfway through the course, we would go, the trainees would go down to Longebaan to the jet training school and complete their wings on Impala Mark 1 jet training system. And then go to hone those skills and to consolidate again on Impalas at various of the Impala squadrons. After that, the training would then be done on the Impala Mark 1 and 2, which were the main training aircraft and light combat aircraft of the time, prior to going on to the Mirage course, which was the supersonic fighter course in those days, and from then go out to the various frontline operational squadrons. So the 3-tier there referring to Harvard, to Impala, and to Mirage. Chair.
In paragraph 10, you indicate that the types of aircraft were acquired as an ongoing process of renewal of the aging equipment and were procured from various countries and companies throughout the 70s and 80s, in which period sanctions were becoming more and more effective and technology was developing at an ever-increasing rate. Can you elaborate on that paragraph, please?
Yes, as also alluded to by the Deputy Chief of the Air Force, once we were qualified in those days, those that qualified on the Mirage 3 would then go on to a variety of different types of frontline operational aircraft, and all these aircraft were in various stages of age, capability, and technology. If you look at there were both bomber and fighter type of aircraft in those days, and these aircraft from time to time would be phased out and replaced by other aircraft. So what I think I'm trying to allude to is that acquisition was an ongoing process like in the rest of the Air Force, and very much so in the fighter line, that as aircraft became aged or reached their obsolescence, they would be replaced, and these were from various different countries and from various different companies in those countries. But as we headed deeper and deeper into the era, the sanctions became a major challenge. And so you found then that less and less opportunities were available to the Air Force to replace these aircraft platforms from a wide choice of suppliers. And so it ended up then being a very limited supply from where these aircraft could come. And it is during that time also that technology in aircraft started to take large leaps forward in terms of digital cockpits and moving from what I would term an analog to a more digital type of aircraft. Chair.
I think General Malinga has already taken us through the history in respect of the World War II, the Korean War, and the Bush War, which went on until the late 80s. In paragraph 12, you are indicating that the Impala Mark II was also used in numerous collateral operational roles in lower threat scenarios during the war. Now, the conflict and threat, you say, were building up, and therefore the defense budget grew over the years to fund, develop, and sustain a formidable South African defense force, of which the SAF was part of. Can you just take us through that?
Yes, Chair. Although the frontline aircraft were there, the South African Air Force, I believe, has always made maximum use of all of its resources. I think you heard from my Navy colleagues and from General Malinga that these assets will always be in high demand. They are normally very scarce for the demands placed on them, particularly when one is in a high level of conflict. And so the Air Force also made use, in particular, of the Impala Mark II in the Bush War as a collateral light fighter doing various tasks that it could be done safely and very effectively, although it was a training aircraft as such. And so what I'm alluding to is that this collateral role has always been part of the Air Force making maximum use of all of its assets. However, this means that the aircraft is not designed to be a fully operational aircraft, but to start to show that already the demands were such on the higher performance platforms that the Impala also played an important role during the Bush War, during particularly the late 70s and early 80s. But once the threat started to build up very high, you found then that the Impala was not able to be employed in as many areas as your frontline fighters, but certainly need not only be a training asset. Thank you, Chair.
Now, in paragraph 13, you talk about the Air Force being an integral part of a balanced defense force. Can you explain to us what does that mean?
Yes, I think, again, my Navy colleagues and General Malinga also alluded to this, but perhaps from a fighter perspective, I think due to the complexity of war and operations which were starting to occur, in the 80s, certain countries were already starting to realize the challenges of a new role, being the peacekeeping type of operations that other than war. These were terms which were starting to be looked at by the military. And with this expansion from straight conventional war, defense assets had to become even more flexible and adaptable. And so I think the Air Force found itself in exactly the same position. Any defense force, as is alluded to worldwide, can only be balanced if it has a balance of land forces, air forces, naval forces, special forces, and medical services, as is the general remit of any good defense force. Obviously, if you are a landlocked country or you are surrounded by sea, then this balance will change in one way or the other. But essentially, if you do not have a balanced capability, then you do not truly have an effective defense capability. It also doesn't help if you have although you may have all the assets, but they are wrongly balanced and mixed, then you also will not achieve such a optimum capability. And so already in the 80s, I think that South African Defence Force started to realize the importance of being very aware of these changes and also adapting to them at that time, Chair.
General Malinga has, to a certain extent, dealt with the concept of, or the key tenets of air power, flexibility, mobility, and firepower. Do you want to add to that? And
Chair, if I may just go back to my previous statement. I saw that I did have it in my statement. But it's very important also to allude to the fact that it was during this time, I think, that the realization of the importance of organizations, not only directly defense forces, but the importance for us of an organization like Arms Corps, of our research institutes, of our universities, of our local industry. These are key elements of air power that became more and more, I would say, important during this era. And the importance of a partnering and an understanding of these tenets of air power, not only of air power, but of a defense force. Apologies, I didn't allude to that in my previous statement. To come to the three tenets of air power, namely flexibility, mobility, and firepower, which can be utilized and delivered rapidly with surprise and over long ranges. I know that General Malinga also alluded to some of this. But in terms of the fighter line, of course, it is your fighter aircraft that deliver a large part of the Air Force's firepower. Also, they do it with precision because the aircraft are designed to do this, and of course can do it over long distances and very rapidly, which can turn events in favor of any campaign or battle. Generally, this will be done earlier in the campaign, and also, as has been seen in history, very important, is to gain over certain areas at certain times what is termed air superiority. This is to ensure then that enemy aircraft cannot hamper or attack your own ground forces or naval forces when they move into the area, which services. Thank you, Chair.
in paragraph 15, you indicate that it is for those reasons that the South African Air Force acquired a fighter aircraft with an in-flight refueling capability. Can you just stop there and please explain for us what does that mean?
Yes, Chair, as you saw on the presentation, fighter aircraft are not that large, so they carry a certain amount of fuel, and fuel is very important because it gives you your range and your reach to do the task. In the late 60s and early 70s, Air Forces started to develop fighter aircraft with an in-flight refueling capability. This meant that while flying in the air, fighter aircraft could receive fuel from a typical in-flight refueler tanker aircraft, normally converted airline type of aircraft, but in our case, the Buccaneer, which we bought in the 60s, also had what was termed a buddy in-flight refueling system. This was a pod that was put under the aircraft. As you saw, the Buccaneer was a large bomber aircraft. It could carry a refueling pod under the wing, and it was then used to refuel other Buccaneers in that role, which gave that Buccaneer system a very long-range maritime strike or bombing capability. The Mirage F1AZs that we acquired in the 70s came with in-flight refueling, as did the Cheetah upgrade, included in-flight refueling into our combat aircraft. This to give further reach for the long-range interdiction and long-range strike capability, which the Air Force is then able to deliver for the country. In the 1980s, this reach became more and more important as the Air Force found itself extended, not only in the Bush War, but as foreseen may be the case in the future. And so a more substantial in-flight refueling capability was required. And the Air Force acquired 5 Boeing 707 in-flight refueling aircraft, generally termed the KC-135 by many other countries. And these aircraft were also very versatile because they also had the capability of doing electronic warfare on a very large scale. They could carry a lot of sensors and do that role, as well as could be used for heavy freight and even troop passenger or ordinary passenger aircraft as well. And so these came in the era of the 1980s, and they flew through till 2007 in the Air Force, and they were then primarily used as in-flight refueling for the Mirage F1 aircraft, as well as the Cheetah aircraft that were upgraded. I think you also saw on the photo that I showed on Wednesday, sir, that we still had these aircraft in the initial stages of the Ukosi project, and in fact to clear the Gripen with its in-flight refueling and the Hawk, these were done on our own South African Boeing 707s when that was done just before they were phased out in 2007. Thank you, Chair.
Can you elaborate more on the electronic warfare?
Yes, throughout, from about the 1970s onwards and today very much so, we see in the world today how important electronic media is. You have, Chair, probably read about and heard about what is now termed cyber warfare, and most defense forces now focus on this domain. Electronic warfare was the first time, I think, when it was realized that aircraft A could be protected from many of the ground threats, the surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft type of fire, as well as missiles from other aircraft, could be protected by means of electronic warfare measures. These are either what we call flares, which create a very high heat source. They are fired from the aircraft, and they deflect the missile, which is homing in on the high temperature engine of the aircraft, and then this flare will deflect the missile away from the aircraft and so protect the aircraft and give it self-protection. There is also a thing called chaff, which also can be thrown because some missiles have radar guidance. The chaff is then used to confuse the radar tracking devices, and so not allow the aircraft to be tracked, and therefore if the aircraft can't be tracked, then it cannot be fired on as accurately. The next development in electronic warfare was what was called active, where actually then electronic measures are used within the aircraft electronically to defeat the other aircraft's missiles or ground systems. And this is a type of cat and mouse game that has been going on for the last 30 years, highly technology driven, in which you find phases in which the electronic countermeasures are on top, and then your manufacturers, of course, of the weapons will go and find a defeat for that, and then so it goes on. So you tend to get terms like electronic countermeasures, and then you get electronic countermeasures for this. And the Air Force has always had a very good niche capability in this area, and so has our local industry. And this gave us a very strong capability on our aircraft platforms from the 1980s onwards in particular. Chair, thank you.
Did the South African Air Force have this capability, electronic warfare, in the digital era?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question for me?
Did the South African Air Force have this capability during the analog era?
Chair, yes, they did. On the Mirage F1 aircraft, the system was carried in what was called a pod, an electronic pod under the aircraft, like a drop tank or a weapon. So you had to give up a station as such to give you that self-protection. The Cheetah, when it was introduced, had an internal electronic warfare system, which meant that it was embodied inside the aircraft and did not need to carry an external store. The same applies for the Hawk and the Gripen today. They have internal, what is termed an electronic warfare suite. The suite refers to the makeup of all the equipment that forms the electronic warfare part of the aircraft. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The last sentence in paragraph 15 states that in the very same era, you have referred to the mid-80s, there were dedicated variant of types were required for different roles, namely air-to-air defense, air-to-surface attack, and reconnaissance. Can you just give details to that?
Chair, in that era, for example, if I had to allude to the Mirage F1s, there was a dedicated Mirage F1 CZ, which was the air defense role aircraft. This would carry a air-to-air radar in the nose of the aircraft. It would be designed to carry a maximum air-to-air missiles, and its avionics would be dedicated to this air-to-air role. The Mirage F1 AZ, which was termed the ground attack version, would not have an air-to-air radar, but it would have an air-to-ground laser sensing radar, for example, and this was because it would carry out the role of air-to-ground or air-to-surface attack, throwing bombs, delivering air-to-surface munitions, etc. And its avionics system and its hardpoints would be then designed for these type of weapons. And then in the case of the reconnaissance version, we did not use the Mirage F1. We still had the old Mirage 3 RZs. They had a platform which the nose was adapted to take cameras, photo cameras, which would take photographs of targets and gather intelligence through photography. And that was a dedicated role. It, for example, did not carry necessarily any missiles or other types of armament. It was dedicated for that role and would be designed for that. And this was how aircraft in general up to the 80s were designed and operated by air forces worldwide. With the advent of digital cockpits and more modern cockpits, of course, this changed. Thank you, Chair.
In other words, you required more aircraft with different variants in order to perform various tasks. Am I correct?
Chair, that is correct. In the case of the F1s, we acquired 32 Mirage F1 AZs and 16 Mirage F1 CZs, and they had separate roles and were dedicated for that role. So in those days, for each role, you would have a dedicated type of aircraft, although it might have come from the same manufacturer and look very similar, but in terms of its insides or its capabilities, it was designed for a particular task, Chair.
You indicate that the Second Air Force retained the three-tier system throughout its history, and prior to phasing out of the SABC aircraft in 1980, there was a total of about 350 jet trainer, fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance aircraft. General Malinga alluded to the fact that it were about 355. Can you just give detail there?
Yes, that is so. Remember, at this time, the Bush War was becoming a higher and higher threat area and far more intense. More forces were being entered into that campaign, and so the defense budget at that time, of course, was high. A large part of the government spending was going into defense. We were in sanctions, so it was not easy to get equipment. If we did, this equipment was very expensive, and as I said, had long what we term lead times due to sanctions. And so I think what we're alluding to there is that at that time, as is typical, when you are under threat and you have a very or are fighting a war, then the budget will increase. You will have more assets, and we were a very formidable and large air force inside a large South African Defence Force at the time, because of the requirement in the 80s. Chair.
So the SABC aircraft had reached its life cycle by the 80s. Am I correct?
That is correct. And as I alluded to, then went into their phase-out phase and were then replaced by other aircraft, Chair.
In paragraph 17, you indicate that by the early 80s, many aircraft manufacturers were developing fly-by-wire controlled airframes with electronically controlled engines, digital cockpits with integrated avionics, including sophisticated electronic warfare suites and precision weapons delivery capabilities. before you deal with it, can you explain what is the fly-by-wire controlled airframe?
Yes, Chair, in aircraft before this era, the aircraft control system was, in the very early days, what we called a push-pull rod system. It was very simple. The aircraft flying control, or stick as we call it, and throttle were connected mechanically through a series of rods and integrated engineering connections to all your control surfaces, as well as, in the case of the engine, from your throttle or accelerator, as would be known in a motor car, to the engine. This was all done mechanically. And the cockpit itself, of course, was designed with many dials to monitor the system in terms of safety and integrity and performance. And then in this era, the leaders in this transfer realized the capabilities and the need to move from what is termed the analog or push-pull control types of systems to fly-by-wire type of systems, which are digitally controlled. So in this era, where the input of the pilot to the stick was in ratio to the deflection or to the performance that he required of the aircraft at the time, now a control stick on a digital aircraft or fly-by-wire aircraft is a movement. It's a very small movement, and that is then electronically generated through a computer to the controls, which will carry out the performance of the aircraft. This meant that aircraft in this era could increase performance largely because it was so much more controlled via computer than via input of the aircrew member as such. The same on the engine side, this would be controlled. In older aircraft, you would have many limitations and restrictions. For example, when you wanted to open the throttle very rapidly, which you need to do in the fighter line, you had to go through stages and gates to open the throttle. And you had to monitor before you went to full power that you were not exceeding other limitations inside the cockpit. With a digital system, it's what you call engine carefree control, and in terms of flying the aircraft, you can move the stick and not be concerned of causing damage to the airframe or over-fatiguing the aircraft. This is then digitally controlled by the aircraft to prevent that. So not only did it increase the performance of the aircraft, it also increased the performance of aircrew, because now aircrew did not have to concentrate or spend so much time training and concentrating on the engine and flying the aircraft. But this was then allowed to be done and spend more time using the aircraft in the role, looking outside of the cockpit and doing the task at hand. So it was quite an enormous step forward in terms of modern aircraft. And this was, at that time, led in the military aviation domain, mainly in, I think, the combat aircraft domain. As you know today, all airliners that you fly in today are virtually all gone to the same type of technology, and of course have advanced it much further as it has in the military. And I think if in simple terms, I hope I answered the question, Chair. Thank you.
You give examples of aircrafts which had these capabilities: the F-16, the MiG-29, and Mirage 2000. Can you just explain to us?
Yes, I think I'm just trying to allude that this was happening both in the West and in the East. It was more driven by, as I said, technology and the need to keep up. And so you find that most of the large aircraft manufacturers at the time, as always happens in these matters, don't want to be left behind. So you found that all of them were putting effort into this technology jump. And that's probably also why it happened quite quickly, Chair.
The F-16 and MiG-29 and Mirage 2000, when you say it was the West and East, can you explain that in detail?
The F-16 was built by an American company, and the MiG-29 was built by a Russian company, and the Mirage 2000 by a French company. So you had it was happening in the USA, it was happening in Europe, and it was happening in the Eastern Bloc countries as well, this development, Chair.
The Mirage 2000 was the advanced version of the Mirages that the Air Force had utilized in the past?
Yes, the Mirage 2000 was the replacement in the French and many of the other countries that the French had sold Mirage 3s to, eventually went to the Mirage 2000, which was the digital version of the Mirage 3 with, as I said, this new technology and new engine. Chair.
When we phased out the Mirages, was not a consideration to look at the Mirage 2000?
The time when the cheetah program commenced to deliver the first cheetahs in 1986, this were very early days of the development of these other aircraft, in particular the Mirage 2000, for starters. And of course, secondly, remember that sanctions were still very much alive and well. And so at that time, the decision taken was to enter into a cooperation with the Israeli aircraft industries and our local industry and Arms Corps in order to upgrade our Mirage 3s to this type of standard of aircraft as an upgrade program. Chair.
And in paragraph 18, you allude to this fact that to keep with the advances in the air power domain, the South African Air Force, Arms Corps, and local industry embarked on a program with the Israeli aircraft industry to upgrade the Mirage 3 aircraft to the Cheetah standard and enable the South African Air Force to enter the digital era of fighter aircraft operations. It is this partnership that you have alluded to.
That is correct, Chair.
The dual and single-seater variants of Cheetah aircraft were delivered to the South African Air Force between 1986 and 1994. Who was the supplier?
As I alluded to, we already had our Mirage 3s. So what happened was the development of this program was done in conjunction with Israeli Air Industries. The aircraft then were taken to, in those days, Atlas Aircraft Corporation. And Atlas Aircraft Corporation, together with the Israeli industries and our own local industry and our own resources, these aircraft were what was termed upgraded to Cheetah standard, which meant a digital cockpit avionics system was included. The airframe was adapted to get additional controls on them to make them more efficient, as had been learnt at that time, what was termed canards in the front. If you compare Mirage 3 to a Cheetah, you'll notice it has a set of extra small wings in front of the main plane wings. These were termed canards, and they allowed the aircraft to have a much higher angle of attack and other performance attributes that you require for a fighter aircraft than the Mirage 3. And also some strengthening was done on certain parts of the old Mirage 3s to upgrade them to the Cheetah standard. So these were not new aircraft. These were our already aging Mirage 3 aircraft that were given an upgrade and were then able to continue flying for a longer period of time. Chair.
And you indicate further that the exposure to the digital era aircraft, it enabled the South African Air Force to grasp the value of a multi-role type fighter. Can you expand on this?
Yes. Here for the first time, the possibilities, again, remember that we were in sanctions. We did not have exposure to the world's technology and to the world's other developments in this domain. So this was a large learning curve, not only for us, but also for industry, for all of those institutes and all the agencies that I mentioned earlier. And when the program was developing, and then when we got the aircraft and started to fly the aircraft, we realized that with these new systems that are so highly integrated and capable in the role with the modern equipment, that it would, in all likelihood, be possible to have a single aircraft look at doing different roles. The Cheetah was not there yet fully, but certainly compared to the Mirage F1s and the older aircraft that we had, this first step was being taken to realize that by changing just the avionics, you could change the role of the aircraft. Although the Cheetah, as I said, was not designed to be fully multi-role. I would almost call it was a stepping stone to where we are today. And I think it was a valuable stepping stone, and we had the opportunity to learn about before we went into the modern era as such, despite the sanctions, Chair.
Now, you mentioned further that after the Bush War in the 80s, then there were peace talks and also a political solution in the Republic. Then you mentioned that there was a budget cut which was drastic in the early 90s. Many squadrons closed and a lot of aircraft were phased out, which included the Canberra Buccaneer, Mirage F1CZ, and some Impala Cheetah aircraft. Can you just elaborate on this?
Yes, Chair. I think, as you heard, it was also alluded to by my Navy colleagues at that period in time, and also Deputy Chief. In the fighter line, it was particularly a large cut for us, because again, coming into a more peaceful situation, as normally would happen, and your conventional threat receding, and the possibility of peace, and coming out of that era, the many other priorities, government priorities at the time, and of course the general economic situation at the time, forced the government into these large budget cuts in defense. And so the Buccaneer and Canberra had been flying, as you heard earlier, since the 50s and 60s, and these aircraft were phased out. Also by now, we had realized, again, that the Cheetah could carry out bombing role, fighter role, and reconnaissance role as a single platform. So this also, I believe, at the time, although I was, of course, not in that anywhere near that level of decision making, but if I had to look back, these were major changes taking place. And I think, having the lessons at the time, the decision makers in the military could make these decisions and therefore live with these aircraft also being phased out as a reality. And also moving towards more modern equipment, which of course is more cost effective than the older equipment. And so these cuts were taken, and also at the time, interestingly, when the Navy mentioned about personnel, the Air Force also had to, for the first time, reduce personnel. And I remember that was one of the less pleasant tasks of being a squadron commander at the time, if you remember, and that is why I remember those times. And so they were tough times. But yes, it had to be done. And many of the Impala squadrons, which were all over the country at that time, had to also close down. And that's where I mentioned earlier, where a lot of the Impala assets were grouped and consolidated at 85 Combat Flying School. So a large impact on our Air Force at that time, but prudent, I believe, looking back. We all know that hindsight is a perfect science, but I think at that time it was prudent to have gone through those. And I think the decisions of which aircraft were phased out and which were kept was also a sound decision, in that we kept the Mirage F1AZs. They were in a much better condition than the CZs, and also the Cheetah C that was coming in had the best or the latest technology in for the air defense role. And so the Mirage F1s were retained for air-to-ground role in 1990. I think, I would imagine at the time there was still some nervousness that not all was there yet, although the situation in Southwest Africa was starting to find its feet. Our internal situation was still in early days. And so it wasn't a matter of taking all the aircraft out. But once again, if I look back, now and see the decisions that had to be taken, I think they were sound in terms of which aircraft were phased out and which were kept. The Impalas then were shrunk because, as I alluded to by now, the Impalas were, Impala Mark 1s, the trainers were already at that stage about coming up for 30 years old, and the Mark 2s, which had flown extensively in the Bush War, in a collateral role with high fatigue factor on them. They had been flown hard in hot and high conditions, and although their age was not that long, the fatigue on the aircraft was quite high because of the type of flying and the type of operations, being a very light type of combat aircraft, and put through some pretty harsh flying during the Bush War. They were also starting to show signs. So the ones that had the higher fatigue were the ones that were phased out, and the aircraft with less fatigue and more hours left were then retained to see the Air Force through until they could be replaced at the time. So I think in short that summarizes the situation at that point. Chair.
Reduction of personnel, did it mean also the pilots and the aircrew?
Yes, at that time it was across ground crew, across all of the services, or the musterings. Sorry, not the services. The musterings within the Air Force. There was a balance of that program. Chair.
Chair, I see it's 11:30.
Thank you. Maybe let's break for 15 minutes. We'll be back at quarter to 12. Thank you. All rise. Can the witness confirm that he's still under oath?
Thank you, Chair. General Bain, we're still dealing with paragraph 19 of your statement. And in particular, I just want to know from you, when you say that this aircraft were phased out, does it mean that they were destroyed, or what do you mean about it?
Chair, all aircraft systems and military equipment goes through a defined process of what is termed phase-out and disposal. In fact, it's also the final phase of a project. So, for example, as Combat Systems Director currently, if systems are phased out, it would be in my remit now to phase them out. And in this case, it's done through our Chief Logistics Agency mainly, and also Arms Corps involved. They are the agency finally that take it to its finality. And this equipment can either be offered for other users, or would often happen is that in the case of the Air Force, we would what we call reduce the frame to the frame only. In other words, you would take out the usable spares and units in the aircraft that can still be used economically to keep your fleet going, generally termed reduced to produce in the aviation game. So you're reducing your fleet, but you use some of that to produce more hours and extend those that remain behind if you're not phasing the total system out. If you're phasing the total system out and replacing it, then it will go for a certain amount of time into a marketing support loop where there is opportunity for other agencies to acquire the equipment, or finally then the aircraft are then scrapped in certain cases through a formal process, Chair.
Now, in paragraph 20, you indicate that following the 1994 elections and the adoption of the new constitution, there was a white paper published in 1996 and a defense review which followed in 1998. General Malinga and Admiral Green have spoken about this. And further, that in the same period, the defense budget cuts were made in 1997, which shrunk the South African Air Force fighter fleet even more. Can you expand on that?
Yes, Chair. The impact on that for the fighter line was that the Mirage F1AZ that I alluded to earlier was retained in 1990. It was decided to phase this aircraft fleet out. The Cheetah by now was fully delivered in 1994, and there were adequate Cheetah aircraft, and having realized the multiple role of that Cheetah, the decision was taken then when the further cuts came to phase out the Mirage F1AZ. Some of the earlier deliverable Cheetahs, some of the what was termed the Cheetah E model, which was more focused on ground attack, was also phased out. And some, but the Cheetah Cs were retained with the Impalas. The Impala fleet, however, was again further reduced due again to the times in which we were now living. There was elections. The country had gone through democratic elections. It was moving to a much more peaceful era, and hence indications of the work being done over that period between the white paper and, as alluded to by previous colleagues, the defense review in process, indications were that the threat had largely reduced, and for this reason then these cuts could be accommodated. And again, I think understandably, there were other priorities for the government to shift funds to, at that point in 1997, Chair.
You mentioned in particular that the Impala fleet of aircraft was aging at that time, and with a life to maximum 2003. And the remaining Cheetah fleet was estimated to have an upgrade life until 2008 for the dual-seater and 2012 for the single-seater. Can you expand on that?
Chair, the Impala Mark 1s were now reaching about 35 years, and what happens in cases like this is the engineering and logistics musterings and fraternity in the Air Force, their job is continually, during the life of an aircraft system, is to closely monitor these aircraft in terms of their age, also the fatigue that is put on the aeroplane. As I alluded to earlier, fighter aircraft spend a large part of their times under what is termed G-forces, accelerating, rapidly climbing, rapidly descending, carrying weapons. It's a very harsh and a very high workload domain for aircraft as compared, for example, with airliners or transport aircraft that tend to climb, cruise, and descend. So this is very carefully monitored by engineers and logisticians, and they then continually will predict for you how long this fleet of aircraft with your remaining aircraft will be able to still fly with integrity, with good airworthiness, and safely. And at this stage, the Impala Mark 1 fleet was deemed then to have a life to 2003. And as I alluded to earlier, although the Impala Mark 2s were brought into service later than the Mark 1s, they bore the brunt of the day-to-day flying in the fighter line during the Bush War, and again, under very harsh conditions. And so you found that although the aircraft in age were younger or less than the Mark 1, the fatigue on those aircraft was climbing. And this is why Air Forces have these engineering officers and airworthiness people continually with the manufacturer to monitor this. And at this point in time, it was realized that this fleet of aircraft would not go past the 40 years. It was beyond the normal predicted life of an average fighter system is between about 25 and 30 years. And so certainly these aircraft had served very well up to this point in time, but needed to be replaced then for age and also for what was termed obsolescence, which is when you start to find that certain of your components on the aircraft, due to them being age and that perhaps model of engine or part has been replaced well before the time. And although one acquires larger numbers of these in obsolescence, many were acquired as a package, of course, again during the sanctions era. And so access to these was becoming a problem, as well as some of these were becoming very, very difficult and very high-cost items to maintain. And so looking at that total picture, the Air Force then tabled the need to replace the aging and obsolescent Impala system at that point, Chair. In terms of the Cheetahs, they had come into service, remember, as I said, as an upgrade. Now, before you do an upgrade on a system, you will obviously weigh up the cost and the advantages of an upgrade versus an acquisition. And you will also make sure then that if you're going to expend funds on an upgrade, that these will, as best one can determine, have the legs to last for that prediction. And so again, the engineers with the team that did the Cheetah program made a prediction that the Cheetah Ds would be able to be operated cost effectively and safely with integrity and airworthiness to 2008, and the single-seater Cheetahs till 2012. The only difference, or the reason why, is that the duals were delivered first in about from 1986-87, because obviously you'd want them to first train the pilots on. And as I alluded to earlier, the fact that we were taking our pilots for the first time into a digital cockpit in a high-performance aircraft, so we did not have any other digital aircraft yet to train them on, those meant that, for example, my conversion onto the Cheetah was quite a lot longer than counterparts who did their conversion on the Mirage 3, which went about the flying of the aircraft and not so much on the systems, you find that the course was a bit longer, and also to make sure that that transition was done well and safely, especially initially. And so you found that the single-seaters then came quite a lot later, because emphasis was put on first getting the cheetah Ds in service, then the Es, and then the Cs. That is the only reason why that gap existed. So you found that your cheetah Cs, which started arriving about around 1991 through to 94, got their upgrade about 4 years later, and so could last as such 4 years later. I hope that puts that into perspective. And the reason then being, again, that the airframes, of course, by then, would be airframes that were acquired in the 1960s through to 2012. So once again, in general, the South African Air Force has utilized its fleet well beyond the norm of 25 to 30 years in virtually all its cases of its combat and fighter aircraft. Chair.
You continue on in paragraph 21 to say that from the history that you have already painted, the South African Air Force combat capability was developed over decades into a formidable air power capability for the Republic. So this was despite the isolation and the sanctions.
Yes, Chair, I think that during that build-up and that time, certainly for our position, and of course the threat was always high. We were isolated, and so the capability was built up. But right from the beginning, as alluded to by the Deputy Chief of the Air Force, the need to have air power in this part of the continent and this part of the world, I think, was also the reason why the Air Force was always well balanced within the South African National Defence Force. As is alluded to as well, is that the air is a domain that does not have the restrictions which landward forces or landward capabilities has. Even on the sea, it is easier than necessary than on the land. But even on the sea, as alluded to, weather and conditions and many other environmental and climatic and factors affect those forces. The Air Force, on the other hand, does not have the same limitations in terms of the environment, and therefore, by having a balanced Air Force, you always have a capability that can operate in that domain and carry out that role. And so I believe that it is important for that part of the Defence Force to be retained and to be advanced. And I think it is shown by the fact that in our history up to now, right from the beginning, we always made sure that we had a balanced Air Force with adequate capabilities to meet the requirements of the day. The challenge, of course, even though we went into sanctions at great cost, but again, with a lot of innovation, meant that we were able to build up a local industry with the assistance of Arms Corps and our other agencies. We had good universities, we had good institutes, CSIR, and many others who could ensure that together with the Department of Defence and the Defence Force, were able to keep South Africa abreast and up to date with these developments. Because once you start to fall behind in these areas of technology and local industry capability and Air Force, and I think my Navy colleagues alluded how important this is once you even fall behind, I don't even want to mention not have or have a break in these capabilities. It is extremely difficult and risky and costly to retain them and to build them up again. Chair.
Thank you. Now, paragraph 22, you reiterate the fact that you retained the three-tier combat training system throughout the history of the South African Air Force, gained experience, and further built close ties with numerous foreign air forces, allowing it to benchmark and remain a respected force worldwide. So this relationships with the foreign air forces was through the isolation period and the sanctions?
I would go back further than that, alluded to again. I mean, starting right off initially way back in 1920 with the Royal Air Force at the time. Then, of course, the Commonwealth Air Forces during the 20s and 30s, the Allied forces during the Second World War, the American Air Force during Korea, where we were actively operating with such air forces. And I think what I'm alluding to is we were not developing in isolation. We were able to benchmark with formidable other air forces, big and small, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and others. And then, of course, during the going into sanctions, yes, this did become somewhat of a problem. But again, defense forces being serving the state and being more of a national asset, again, you are able to keep up perhaps a bit easier with certain of those matters and networks that are there. But I think importantly in that era again was the fact that we were able to innovate and be able to survive through that sanctions period as well. And then, of course, in the Bush War, we did not have to benchmark, but we had a very formidable enemy in the forces that were building up, particularly in the domain of ground-based defense systems. There was a formidable radar coverage, there was a formidable surface-to-air missile and anti-aircraft blanket put down in that area. And this forced us then to also counter that. And hence I said earlier how important electronic warfare became for us, which became a niche. And in fact, one of our local companies became renowned for the work that they did in this domain. And so, although we were in sanctions, and we perhaps could not benchmark as widely, we had the advantage also then of having a very formidable system through which we were able to also learn lessons, benchmark, and position the South African Air Force for the times ahead. Chair.
So you'd say that the reduction of our air capability from 355 aircrafts to lesser aircrafts did not weaken the SA Air Force?
I think it obviously weakened us numbers-wise and gave us challenges in terms of having perhaps a more variety of platforms, to operate with and to fly with. But in my opinion, if I look back with hindsight, I think it was always done professionally. The phase-outs were done with good applied military thinking and, of course, taking cognizance, understandably so, of the changes and the funding and the government imperatives at the time. So it was managed. It was not a matter of doing something rapidly or that was not planned and thought out before the time. And I think it proved that we managed to go through that transition period from being almost in a full-out war through the peace, the elections, the new constitution, and the new approach to defense and transformation, but yet retained an Air Force that remained a balanced partner of a capable SANDF through that period. Chair.
The advent of the mid-90s, you say that there was a debate over the replacement of the Impala and the upgraded Cheetah fleets, and the Impala needed to be replaced by 2003, and the upgraded Cheetah medium fighter needed to be replaced by 2008 and be operational by 2012. Now, why were this debate in the 1990s and not thereafter?
The replacement of the, of course, Impala fleet was the most urgent at that time, due, as I alluded to earlier, that they did not go through an upgrade program and would only be able to fly till 2003, and therefore they needed to be replaced. And I think, as alluded to by colleagues, the process of replacing equipment of that nature through a cardinal project, and this will even be further alluded to by my colleague from the Material Division, Captain Jordan, when he testifies as to the project processes and that domain. But the average lifespan, from the time the requirement is started to be debated, written, contracted, produced, delivered, implemented and operational is a minimum of around 10 years and can even be longer before that system is fully operational. And what you don't want is you, at all costs, as I alluded to earlier, you want to prevent, Chair, a gap developing where your prediction maybe is normally very accurate, but let's say the Impalas were to be phased out earlier and were not yet replaced. You would then have a serious gap in your training again to meet your frontline capability, and alternatively, if you sat without a frontline capability, that far in advance, it's very difficult to predict that there would be no need or that a threat would not develop. So I think to put that in perspective, as I said, generally speaking, these things are always ongoing. There are engineering teams, there are the pilots who are starting to say, but listen, these aircraft are starting to have more issues and problems logistically, which will happen towards the end. And therefore, you find that they start to become more costly to operate, and so you reach a point where you need to take a decision that something needs to be done, and generally then it will be a project which, as I said, takes quite a long time. Hence the debate started at that time. Chair.
I mean, as a director, combat systems, what would be the consequences of a gap you're referring to?
The gap in your training would be very serious, and in fact I can allude to a situation that did occur on the programs. It will be alluded to more later, but as happened with the Impala, there was a situation where they had to be terminated at a point in time when we thought we might have been able to get a little longer time out of them, and then with the new aircraft coming in, there was a gap that was created in our training from our then Astra onto our new lead-in fighter trainer. And I can assure the Chair and the Commission that it took us a long time just to recover from that small gap in catching up and getting those pilots back to the same standard that they were at when they lost. And this was a small gap that occurred. So, as I alluded to earlier, this is not a capability that is easy to recover from. Secondly, that's in terms of your training. In terms of your system, which is not, remember, only a system for pilots, your ground crew need to practice their skills. They need to work on aircraft, and they are trained on a specific aircraft. So yes, you can move them to another aircraft, but again, that takes time, it's costly, and you'll have to bring them back onto your new platform. Then there are what we term mission controllers and air traffic controllers. Mission controllers work very closely in the radar domain with pilots. Now, if you don't have a training school, then you also start to impact on the training of, for example, your mission controllers, your firefighters, who are specific aviation firefighters, all the other base services that support and deliver the system, all slow down and stop training. So the impact is far greater than just pilot training or just the aircraft. It affects your whole system if you have too big a gap or you at any point lose a capability and have to regain that capability, Chair.
Can it also lead to attrition in terms of loss of air crew and pilots?
One would hope, Chair, that you don't get to that. But obviously, the less then assets that you have and the less training that you can do, because you need an operational need, factors will drive you then, yes. And as we know, in aviation, flying safety is a daily risk, but it is well managed. But when you get to these situations, you have to put a lot more effort and assets into your programs, etc. And clearly, this is not ideal of where you want to get to. And it could be then that you have to also then stop flying regularly due to these factors. And also, the same will happen, as I tried to allude to, if you push that equipment too far past its limit, because the Air Force has to be very professional. You are training people to do a very highly skilled and high-demand job. So I would say that it would be a very difficult obstacle to overcome, Chair.
Now, you indicate further in paragraph 23 that the South African Air Force rationale in 1996 was to replace the Impala fleet with 48 advanced fighter trainers and to replace the Cheetah fleet with 32 future medium fighter aircraft. What informed these numbers?
I think a number of previous colleagues have alluded very much to the white paper, the defense review process, the optimum force design process, and the fighter component was part of that review and that approach. And so in this domain, the initial, what we called fighter master plan, which came out of the operational plans division in the Air Force, looking again forward into the future, what would be required, first of all, looked at replacing our Cheetahs, which were medium fighters, with a future medium fighter. This aircraft would have been, and I tried to allude to this, Chair, when I gave my visuals of the difference between a light fighter, and I used the Gripen in this case, and the Eurofighter, which is a medium fighter. This would have been a twin-engined, large, very high-performance aircraft, which would have replaced the Cheetah fleet. And the number of 32 generally came from the requirement to have 2 squadrons. In the past, and in most air forces, if you can, the ideal is not to end up with only one fighter squadron. The reason for that is because in the fighter community, it is very important to have competition and to have tactics development. And you found in the past, if you ever went into any squadron, it's like that in, I'm sure, many domains. Your professional domain, it must be the same. But in our domain, you are almost fighting each other all the time, because that's how you train. So you found in the past, the guys, the 3 squadron flying the Mirage F1CZ and the Mirage AZ, they didn't talk to each other a lot. They trained, and you create an environment to prepare and train for conflict and for war. Yes, when you go together and you go and do the job, it's a different story. And hence, this 2-squadron concept had come a long way. And so ideally, this is what was required. In those days, a standard, call it NATO, was probably the best term squadron, was 16 aircraft. So 2 squadrons. It went through the force design process that we required 2 frontline fighter squadrons. Hence the 32 future medium fighters, which would be delivered to the 2 fighter squadrons, was the number at that point in time in the early part of the force design process. The number of 32 aircraft was tabled. In terms of in those days, the force design did not address the training aircraft. It only addressed the operational platforms. The Air Force, however, traditionally has included its fighter trainer aircraft as part of its fighter line. It forms part of your combat line. And the reason for that is the type of aircraft that you buy as a fighter trainer will always have some form of what we term collateral operational capability. It just depends how much. If you looked at the Impala Mark II, which was used extensively, as I said, in the Bush War, initially played a large role. However, when the threat built up and many of the ground systems came in, due to its capabilities, its envelope, its speed, and its makeup, the aircraft then became more and more limited, but always would have a form of collateral capability. And so although formally you will not find, if you look at the force design at the time, it said 32 future medium fighters, and it said another squadron of light fighters was in the force design. Additional to that would have then been the trainer aircraft. The thinking at the time then, for 2 squadrons of 32 future medium fighters, you then work out how many training aircraft, and to supply the 16 light fighter squadron, how many training aircraft would we require to train adequate pilots to sustain those squadrons. So it's not only initial training, because remember, like me, Eventually, you get a bit old and to fly the aircraft, and then you are taken out of the cockpit. Others may have a line change. Others may lose their flying medical. Others may decide to leave the Air Force. And so you cannot only just have the exact number. So you work back how many aircraft you require then in what we call to retain a core force capability, so that with this rotation, adequate pilots, ground crew, and all the other services can be trained in order to meet that requirement. And the number then that was required would have been 48 aft aircraft, which were advanced fighter trainer aircraft, of which 16 would be the light fighter squadron, and the remainder would form the training school, as was the Impala at the time, Chair.
General, maybe it's not easy for us to explain to us the difference between your advanced fighter trainers and the future medium fighters by at least taking us through Bundle K, the photos, to show the commission what do you mean by the future medium fighter.
Could I, sorry, just ask for someone's copy? I didn't have it with me here. Thank you. As I said, I think we're all comfortable with the future medium fighter. This would have been in the class of a Typhoon or a Eurofighter, which is on page where the diagram compares the size and shape of the aircraft. So the Gripen, as it stands today, is an advanced light fighter. A future medium fighter would have been in the class then of a Typhoon or Eurofighter, which is extensively used in Europe, which is much larger. It is twin-engined versus the single engine on a light fighter. You can also, looking underneath at the photo of the hard points in terms of carriage of bombs, bomb load, missile load, and other sensors on the aircraft. Obviously, there's a lot more space on the aircraft to put more sensors and equipment in the aircraft. Hence the need for two engines, because now you have to, of course, have the higher performance, but with a much heavier aircraft. It also has to carry more fuel in order to be able to have further reach, because it is in that class of aircraft. The aft, at that point in time, was very then similar to a light fighter, but with the focus on only carrying out light fighter collateral tasks, with a full operational capability for some of the aircraft. The other aircraft, the training aircraft, would then be used for training only. There was a development in certain of the aircraft classes at the time, especially those that were being designed. And the example perhaps would be the 82,000, which, as you knew, was also part of the contenders. And in modern aircraft such as the Gripen and others, you have what is called a war mode and a type of training mode. That purely means that some of the aircraft can be acquired with lesser capability for training, but can also be acquired in a certain other version which could act as a light fighter. This was a further technological development which was starting to become evident in the 90s type of design and aircraft. And thanks. And so the aft, the advanced fighter trainer, was then seen to be this type of aircraft that could transit the pilot safely from a now Astra, because the Air Force is no longer flying the old Harvard. It had received the new Pilatus PC-7 Mark II. We termed it the Astra, which was a more modern trainer. From there to an advanced fighter trainer mode first, a little bit less performance, a little bit less capability, get him used to that. Then a light fighter on the more operational version, and finally take him to the top end, which would have been the future medium fighter, still in the three-tier training approach. Chair.
So the Eurofighter Typhoon, is that what is depicted on page 8 of Bundle K.
Chair.
The Pilates Astra that you have mentioned, at the time of the SDP procurement process, it was not part of thereof. Am I correct?
Chair, the Pilates PC7 Mark II was not part of the packages. It was already in its project phase or stage, and it was at that stage being delivered and replacing the Harvards, which of course, as we alluded to earlier, had been flying since the 1940s. It was a project, in other words, an independent project on its own, and it was bought from the Swiss company Pilates to carry out basic flying training up until the pilot had his Air Force wings. Chair.
The acquisition of the 48 advanced fighter trainers and the 32 future medium fighter aircrafts, they were part and parcel of the force design option 1, which General Malinga has already alluded to. Am I correct?
That's where the numbers came from, yes. I think I must perhaps point out, which was maybe not done at the time, that the military work on the force design was primarily done around 96 and into 97, after which the force design, like the white paper, went through a process to approval. And, you know, if one thinks again, in 97, there was another budget cut that occurred at the time. And so just that it's not, or realized that this is not something that happens rapidly. It happened over a period of time. And during that time, there are other factors that happen. And so you find that in certain areas, the options were run. The option 1 was then decided upon as the force design. But as termed out eventually, and I think the Navy and General Malinga alluded to the fact that that does not mean that that full design will be acquired at that point in time, or perhaps may change and be adapted. And that is reality of what happened, and it was alluded to by my colleagues. And hence, I say, at that point, what was in the design at that point in time were these aircraft at those numbers, Chair.
In paragraph 24, you mentioned that the total capability that was ideal at the time was about 70 aircrafts, which included 32 future medium fighters, 16 advanced fighter trainers, and 22 advanced fighter trainers. Is it for combat school flying? Am I correct?
The 16 would have gone to the light squadron, a standard squadron. The remainder would have been at the combat flying school. So, and that's why I alluded to this period. As the period moved on, there were at times variations of those numbers, particularly on the aft at a point in time as well. So around about a total of 70 to 80 aircraft. Chair.
If I look at the last sentence of paragraph 24, it indicates that the force design did not include training assets, only operational assets. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, Chair. For example, you will not see the Astras in that force design at that time. And it only spoke about operational squadrons, the two squadrons of frontline fighters and the squadron of light fighters. It did not talk about the combat flying school in the force design. It was assumed then that the arm of service would then, those would be additional assets that would have to be in place to train to reach your fully operational platforms in the force design as so. I did allude to the fact, however, that the Air Force has always considered its fighter trainer aircraft to have some form of collateral capability. Chair.
I wanted to refer you to Bundle B, which is the white paper and the force design. I think page 95 thereof. Paragraph 74. Well, it says that the option one, which was chosen ultimately from the four options, it says the chosen forces design option will become the object of implementation planning for the next decade or longer. Does it refer to the 10 years you spoke about that is required to do the planning for the acquisition?
I think this is what I tried to say previously, that during this period, this is already alluding to the fact that you will have a force design, and the options, remember, was a model run by the Department of Defense. I was not part of Optipum, as you know. I was not an expert in it. But if I read this, I think it exactly says that it doesn't mean because of the choice of option one that everything in option one would be acquired, for example, in the packages, or even in that period. But it was a design, a force design, which was deemed adequate for the government at the time in the option one approach, which was cost and not necessarily only needs driven, and tailored for what was best thought to be the future requirements at the time. And so that was chosen as option one. But even being chosen as option one did not mean that you would be able to fund and acquire all of those capabilities immediately. That's how I, in a military term, would read and interpret that as best I can. But I'm not an expert in that field, sir. But I would say, in my interpretation, this is exactly what this is saying. The implementation, therefore, could be longer than the 10 years for all, but that they are also acknowledging, I think, the fact that projects take about 10 years to implement and to bring onto inventory. Chair.
When we proceed with the very same paragraph, it says that, however, the realization of this force design will be influenced by periodic revisions of the Defense Review and subsequent planning to reflect the continuously changing strategic environment and prevailing circumstances. Can you elaborate on that?
Chair, the best with my knowledge of this domain, which is at the level of the Directorate of Strategic Planning at a DOD level, and I think Admiral Green alluded to the type of work and what was done in that area. This says to me that, as we see today, there is a defense review on the table today, 2013, it's called now. So from time to time, defense reviews will, by nature, I believe, always continue to be done, because the situation will change. The geopolitical situation could change. The economics of the country can change. The demands made, I think some of my colleagues have alluded to the fact that at this point in time, there was a recognition of the upcoming possibility of peace support operations and the role that South Africa would play in Africa, and particularly in SADC. These were evolving at the time. And so I would imagine that to expect a defense review to last for 30 years or however, I don't think, in my view, as a military man, that would not be prudent, and I don't think would be expected. So, yes, every, at least say 10 or 15 years, you would need to do a review, I'm sure, as all large organizations would do, to adapt. And that would mean That is why, again, it comes down to when one does acquisition, is to look at, again, flexibility and adaptability in terms of air acquisitions, so that you try to make sure that what is acquired is adaptable and flexible also to adapt to these changes until a new review or new requirement is placed, Chair. I'm not an expert, but I hope that that has answered your question in context, Chair.
Well, furthermore, the paragraph, it says that the result is that the exact details regarding the type and quantities of main equipment will inevitably deviate from the vision. Can you just enlighten us on what it means?
I think that is I can give a practical example. The final decision then taken, which is in my next paragraph of my statement, but without going there, if you look at what was finally contracted for the STPs to replace the major equipment in the Air Force in December 99, it was considerably less than that which was in option 1 of the force design, alluding to the statement here that that was already, in fact, formally in the design, the acknowledgement that these changes would and could take place during that process, Chair.
Now, if we proceed to paragraph 25 of your statement on page 4, you allude to the effect of the budget cut in 1997, and it had an effect that you had to lower your sights in terms of performance class of the future frontline fighter. Can you just elaborate on that?
In 1997, yes, when those budget cuts came into effect, and with the current funding on the defence capital programs, I'm sure all my colleagues in the other arms of service would have done, or their organisations would have done the same, but the Air Force then had to adapt to these budget cuts as always, because the decision on defence allocations, as you know, is a government decision, and the task then of the then Department of Defence, and in our case the Air Force, needs to cut its cloth to fit in with those realities. And so the Air Force had a look at numerous options which were investigated and considered in order to fit in with these budget cuts and the new realities. I think also some of the debate, and I was at the time at operational plans, I was a fairly junior officer in terms of this level of decision and planning. But I would imagine also, coming out of the 94 elections, which were, as we all know, a wonderful democratic process, and the country was seen to be highly successful, we were also entering into a much more peaceful time. And also, if one looked at the realities of the cost to value of a medium fighter versus these range of limited range but available aircraft in the advanced light fighter aircraft capability area, which were considerably less costly to acquire and to operate than a medium fighter. And I've alluded to the double engine and size and shape of these aircraft. And yet, the capabilities that appeared to be in these type of aircraft, then for the South African Air Force, given the force design and the ongoing challenges of the time, the Air Force then realized that it would not be able to afford the force design of the 32 frontline future medium fighters. And so the requirement for the advanced light fighter aircraft came into being at that point in time.
So in other words, then there was to be a deviation from the initial force design that was envisaged.
Yes, Chair. As I said, I think it was a lowering of sights, a lowering of capability in terms of the Air Force part of the force design, yes, in terms of not necessarily at that point numbers, but in terms of capability.
You proceed on in paragraph 25 to indicate that hence the requirement for an advanced light fighter aircraft and an attempt to try and move to a two-tier fighter training system instead of the three-tier system that was previously in use. Can you expand on that?
Yes, at that time, remember now we had the Astra as the basic flying trainer up until wings. And so, again, due to these constraints, the Air Force, with lowering its sights to a light fighter and not a medium fighter, the option was looked at prudently to see if the Air Force could move to training our fighter pilots from the Pilatus PC-7 Mark II, perhaps look at its expanded envelope in certain areas of training that could possibly fill some of the gap of the advanced fighter trainer, which, if you remember, then would have been between the two, and look at then taking the pilot from that platform straight onto an advanced light fighter type of aircraft. This will only be done if you are cost-driven and not needs-driven to go there, and we've all heard that that is where the situation was lying at on the available funding in the capital program versus all the requirements and challenges facing the department. So the Air Force's attempt to do this, I think, was in line at the time, although, as I said, I was not personally there at all the debates and all of the work that was done, but was attempting to also accommodate the budgetary cuts, but still retain, importantly, a credible and cost-effective frontline fighter capability at the time.
So the two-tier system would therefore mean that from the Pilatus Astra you'd move straight to the Gripen. Am I correct?
At that time to the Alpha. Today, yes, it would have been the Gripen as the selected aircraft to meet the advanced light fighter aircraft. Yes, sir.
However, it appears that this two-tier system did not progress, and you reverted back to the three-tier system ultimately. Am I correct?
Yes, two things were happening at this stage. The advanced fighter trainer program was in process at this point in time, and in parallel was this debate and this review taking place in the Air Force regarding a change in the tier system. The task of the project team at the time, Project Ukosi, were at that stage in the what's termed the request for information stage, and so we were able then to get some information, albeit at a request for information stage which is not detailed, but it did give the opportunity also for some of the members on that team to fly some of the aircraft. I was not part of Project Ukosi at that point, remember, I was still at Directed Operational Planning. And so with their information that came back in the RFIs, as well as the debate that took place in the Air Force, this was a review of the future of where we had to go to. And the final decision that was taken then by the Air Force Command Council at the time, having heard the feedback from the RFI process, as well as inputs given by the various work groups who looked at all these options at the time, was that the Air Force would need to retain and stay with a three-tier training system.
The critics have criticized this abandoning of the two-tier system because they said the two-tier system would have been more cost-effective than the three-tier systems. What's your comment on?
This two-tier and three-tier training debate was not isolated to the South African Air Force, I believe, at the time. A lot of air forces were similarly to the South African Air Force at the time, due to world economic conditions, undergoing similar challenges and similar situations. And this will always remain a debate. I think, Chair, to try to simplify this two-tier or three-tier, if I may, perhaps we could allude to a normal or a similar situation of our own children. If you send your child after passing matric, or nowadays perhaps before they pass grade 12, I think it is, and you sent them to driving school, they would probably go to driving school and drive a car like a Hyundai i30 or perhaps a City Golf and be taught to drive that vehicle and pass their test. You as a parent would then have to decide what vehicle, if you could afford it, or afford to let them drive next, and would you feel, how comfortable would you feel to move to the next step in the vehicle? And to have an anomaly, it would be going from that probably to a job at Ferrari, preparing to drive a Formula One car on a Formula One track in a competition, if I could have that anomaly. An alternate would be to perhaps, if one could afford it, perhaps then give your daughter or your son a few years learning to drive a BMW M3 or still quite a high-performance car, but perhaps not competitively yet and not in that same domain. That is, to me, the simplest way I could explain the difference between a two- and a three-tier system. It is not impossible to do. Anything is probably possible, but at a cost, at a risk, and in time. And so, the proven three-tier system which the Air Force had at the time, where we could train on a basic trainer, then have a stepping stone of a ex-Impala, and in this case a lead-in fighter trainer type of aircraft, and only then put the youngish pilot, probably at the age of 23 or 24, into a high-performance, high-cost asset aircraft, is a matter of safety and risk, not only of cost. Yes, you must consider cost. We are in government. We have a duty to the taxpayer and to our own Air Force and to our other lines, because what you utilize in cost in one area will have to be found from somebody else within an allocated budget. We all understand that. But I would imagine that that would have been a consideration that would have had to be taken into account in terms of two-tier, three-tier. Yes, there are Air Forces that have a two-tier. You will find, however, that that tier aircraft that is in a two-tier is an aircraft that certainly can at least fire weapons, carry a payload. An example could be the Swedish Air Force, which designed the Gripen. They take their Gripen pilots from what is called an SK-60. This is a twin-engine jet trainer. This aircraft has a full weapons load, a full sighting system, and can deliver all of those weapons and do what is termed then to be, albeit an old aircraft, but at least be a stepping stone. They are currently looking at replacing that aircraft now and upgrading. However, the Air Force then would have deemed, I would imagine, finally, the step from an Astra PC-7 basic trainer that could do some lead-in type of fighter training in the flying domain, but did not have weapons, and could not fly in the type of environment and envelope that would act as a gradual and middle-tier stepping stone towards our frontline fighter, and hence the decision to retain the three-tier system. Chair.
So you say in paragraph 26 that the retention of the three-tier system was informed by the request for information. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, some, as I said, from that, some air forces and some of the contenders did indicate that one could transit from a PC-7, Mark 7, to a frontline fighter. However, I think the ultimate decision for that needs to then also be looked at in terms of the Air Force, South African Air Force's situation, and I am sure that it would have been done so, and to make sure which is the best decision to go forward on that case. It is true to say that, as was alluded to by the various reports, and part of the debate is that these modern aircraft, being fly-by-wire engine controlled, yes, they are simpler aircraft to fly. However, they are highly complex integrated systems. Perhaps not understood fully at the time was the different demands, and I alluded to this, I think, earlier when I spoke about the dual-seater and single-seater acquisition of the aircraft, is that the workload on the pilot is a lot higher in a multi-role type of cockpit. He needs to be well prepared because he's got to change from being just air-to-ground, air-to-air reconnaissance, now in the same mission. So yes, in terms of getting the aircraft in the air, flying it in the air, then it is easier to fly. But to operate that system in a complex operational and high-threat environment in a single cockpit is a high demand. And hence, again, the fact that the three-tier system would afford you a far better capability and training capability to reach that level required, Chair, in my opinion.
You mentioned that this whole debate and finally, after having received the RFIs, the adoption of the three-tier system was presented and endorsed by the Armaments Acquisition Council. What is Armaments Acquisition Council?
Chair, first of all, yes, as all these decisions are taken, they are not only taken, there are recommendations, and the final approval for these type of decisions in those days was the Armaments Acquisition Council. It was chaired by the Minister of Defence, and my colleague from the Navy, Captain Jordan, will be elaborating very widely on this process and all the approval boards, etc., during his testimony. He is an expert in that area, and he will be testifying to that. But I can confirm that the Armaments Acquisition Council at the time was the highest Department of Defence council, chaired by the Minister, to which these type of decisions would have been taken by the various services at the time for recommendation and approval. Chair.
Paragraph 27 of a statement, you indicate that even during a period of peace, it is important for a state to maintain a credible deterrent capability as an insurance policy. Can you elaborate on it?
Similar to what the Navy alluded to in terms of the sea, and I'm sure had an Army colleague been here the same, but in terms of the Air Force, the fighter capability of an Air Force, in my view, is a national asset and is an important and a key element of a balanced South African National Defence Force as in any country. As it has transpired, the Republic has become a very important role player in the region, and I'm sure will continue to be so. And so, in doing so, you also have your fighter line and your whole Air Force being a credible deterrent and projecting peace and stability, not only in defending and protecting the country, which is its key mandate from the Constitution, but also in that role of having that deterrent capability and then projecting stability as well. And all of this could be viewed as a type of national, in simple terms, insurance policy. Yes, may not be needed every day to carry out that primary mandate. But while you have those type of assets airborne, or ships at sea, or troops in the field, although they may be training and although they may be preparing, remember, those pieces of equipment on those aircraft are operating. They are listening. They are looking. They are seeing. They are contributing by virtue of being there to national power and to the country. Much wider than just in their main role of preparing for that eventuality when, of course, no other asset could do the same job. And that is when the time comes for that type of capability to be employed, should it be in conflict or peacekeeping or peace enforcement as well. I think, which perhaps was alluded to partly, of all countries, and I think the Deputy Chief spoke about some countries that did not have such capabilities. But you know, if you look at a country, Chair, like Switzerland, this is a neutral country in a region of, up to now, peaceful and stable part of the world, have a formidable defense force. They have a medium fighter. Currently it's the F-18 Hornet. They have a training aircraft. They have an air force. Even though they are a neutral country in a, call it European Union surrounded area, they have that capability as well. So just to add to the debate of the importance of these type of capabilities for a country and for a nation. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, I note it's 1 o'clock.
Can I just get a minor clarity? Currently, which aircraft are involved in the three-tier system?
Commissioner, currently the Pilatus PC-7, which does the training from the time he starts flying for the first time until he receives his Air Force wings, and all Air Force pilots train on this aircraft. Those that are then chosen for the combat line, fighter line, then go to the leading fighter trainer, which today is the Hawk Mark 120, which was acquired through the packages. And our frontline fighter is the Advanced Light Fighter aircraft, which is the Gripen, which was acquired under Project Ukosi in the packages, Commissioner.
Thank you.
We'll adjourn and come back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
defense reviews will, by nature, I believe, always continue to be done because the situation will change. The geopolitical situation could change. The economics of the country can change. The demands made, I think some of my colleagues have alluded to the fact that at this point in time, there was a recognition of the upcoming possibility of peace support operations and the role that South Africa would play in Africa and particularly in SADC. These were evolving at the time, and so I would imagine that to expect a defence review to last for 30 years or however, I don't think, in my view, as a military man, that would not be prudent, and I don't think would be expected. So yes, every at least say 10 or 15 years, you would need to do a review, I'm sure, as all large organizations would do, to adapt. And that would mean, that is why, again, it comes down to when one does acquisition, is to look at, again, flexibility and adaptability in terms of air acquisitions, so that you try to make sure that what is acquired is adaptable and flexible also to adapt to these changes until a new review or new requirement is placed. And the country was seen to be highly successful. We were also entering into a much more peaceful time. And also, if one looked at the realities of the cost to value of a medium fighter versus these range of limited range but available aircraft in the advanced light fighter aircraft capability area, which were considerably less costly, implemented and operational, is a minimum of around 10 years and can even be longer before that system is fully operational. And what you don't want is, you, at all costs, as I alluded to earlier, you want to prevent defense reviews will, by nature, I believe, always continue to be done because the situation will change. The geopolitical situation could change. The economics of the country can change. The demands made, I think some of my colleagues have alluded to the fact that at this point in time, there was a recognition of the upcoming possibility of peace support operations and the role that South Africa would play in Africa and particularly in SADC. These were evolving at the time, and so I would imagine that to expect a defence review to last for 30 years or however, I don't think, in my view, as a military man, that would not be prudent, and I don't think would be expected. So yes, every at least say 10 or 15 years, you would need to do a review, I'm sure, as all large organizations would do, to adapt. And that would mean, that is why, again, it comes down to when one does acquisition, is to look at, again, flexibility and adaptability in terms of air acquisitions, so that you try to make sure that what is acquired is adaptable and flexible also to adapt to these changes until a new review or new requirement is placed. And the country was seen to be highly successful. We were also entering into a much more peaceful time. And also, if one looked at the realities of the cost to value of a medium fighter versus these range of limited range but available aircraft in the advanced light fighter aircraft capability area, which were considerably less costly to acquire and to operate than a medium fighter. And I've alluded to the double engine and size and shape of these aircraft. And yet, the capabilities that appeared to be in these type of aircraft, then for the South African Air Force, given the force design and the ongoing challenges of the time, the Air Force then realized that it would not be able to afford the force design of the 32 frontline future medium fighters. And so the requirement for the advanced light fighter aircraft came into being at that point in time.
So in other words, then there was to be a...
This two-tier and three-tier training debate was not isolated to the South African Air Force, I believe, at the time. A lot of air forces were similarly to the South African Air Force at the time, due to world economic conditions, undergoing similar challenges and similar situations. And this will always remain a debate. I think, Chair, to try to simplify this two-tier or three-tier, if I may, perhaps we could allude to a normal or a similar situation of our own children. If you send your child after passing matric, or nowadays perhaps before they pass grade 12, I think it is, and you sent them to driving school, they would probably go to driving school and drive a car like a Hyundai i30 or perhaps a City Golf and be taught to drive that vehicle and pass their test. You as a parent would then have to decide what vehicle, if you could afford it, or afford to let them drive next, and would you feel, how comfortable would you feel to move to the next step in the vehicle? And to have an anomaly, it would be going from that probably to a job at Ferrari, preparing to drive a Formula One car on a Formula One track in a competition, if I could have that anomaly. An alternate would be to perhaps, if one could afford it, perhaps then give your daughter or your son a few years learning to drive a BMW M3 or still quite a high-performance car, but perhaps not competitively yet and not in that same domain. That is, to me, the simplest way I could explain the difference between a two- and a three-tier system. It is not impossible to do. Anything is probably possible, but at a cost, at a risk, and in time. And so, the proven three-tier system which the Air Force had at the time, where we could train on a basic trainer, then have a stepping stone of a ex-Impala, and in this case a leading fighter trainer type of aircraft, and only then put the youngish pilot, probably at the age of 23 or 24, into a high-performance, high-cost asset aircraft, is a matter of safety and risk, not only of cost. Yes, you must consider cost. We are in government. We have a duty to the taxpayer and to our own Air Force and to our other lines, because what you utilize in cost in one area will have to be found from somebody else within an allocated budget. We all understand that. But I would imagine that that would have been a consideration that would have had to be taken into account in terms of two-tier, three-tier. Yes, there are air forces that have a two-tier. You will find, however, that that tier aircraft that is in a two-tier is an aircraft that certainly can at least fire weapons, carry a payload. An example could be the Swedish Air Force, which designed the Gripen. They take their Gripen pilots from what is called an SK-60. This is a twin-engine jet trainer. This aircraft has a full weapons load, a full sighting system, and can deliver all of those weapons and do what is termed then to be, albeit an old aircraft, but at least be a stepping stone. They are currently looking at replacing that aircraft now and upgrading. However, the Air Force then would have deemed, I would imagine, finally, the step from an Astra PC-7 basic trainer that could do some lead-in type of fighter training in the flying domain, similar to what the Navy alluded to in terms of the sea, and I'm sure had an Army colleague been here the same, but in terms of the Air Force, the fighter capability of an Air Force, in my view, is a national asset and is an important and a key element of a balanced South African National Defence Force as in any country. As it has transpired, the Republic has become a very important role player in the region, and I'm sure will continue to be so. And so, in doing so, you also have your fighter line and your whole Air Force being a credible deterrent and projecting peace and stability, not only in defending and protecting the country, which is its key mandate from the Constitution, but also in that role of having that deterrent capability and then projecting stability as well. And all of this could be viewed as a type of national, in simple terms, insurance policy. Yes, may not be needed every day to carry out that primary mandate. But while you have those type of assets airborne, or ships at sea, or troops in the field, although they may be training and although they may be preparing, remember, those pieces of equipment on those aircraft are operating. They are listening. They are looking. They are seeing. They are contributing by virtue of being there to national power and to the country, much wider than just in their main role of preparing for that eventuality when, of course, no other asset could do the same job. And that is when the time comes for that type of capability to be employed, should it be in conflict or peacekeeping or peace enforcement as well. I think, which perhaps was alluded to partly, of all countries, and I think the Deputy Chief spoke about some countries that did not have such capabilities. But, you know, if you look at a country, Chair, like Switzerland, this is a neutral country in a region of, up to now, peaceful and stable part of the world, have a formidable defense force. They have a medium fighter. Currently it's the F-18 Hornet. They have a training aircraft. They have an air force. Even though they are a neutral country in a, call it European Union surrounded area, they have that capability as well. So just to add to the debate of the importance of these type of capabilities for a country and for a nation. Thank you, Chair.
Chair.